Full disclosure, even though this is the kind of thing that would normally be 100% up my alley, I've never actually listened to a lot of Spectral Lore, so I am more or less going entirely blind into this LP. So, yeah, this should be interesting. Eterόφωτος, which A, I already know I've mispronounced, so don't bother telling me, and B, has no exact English translation, so don't bother asking for one, is the latest studio album from long-running Greek progressive and avant-garde black metal project Spectral Lore, the brainchild and passion project of a gentleman under the alias of Elos. A project that has very much been active in the time that I've been on YouTube. In fact, they put out a critically acclaimed collaborative effort with Mare Cognitum just last year. But despite that, I'm really only vaguely familiar with this band, and honestly, I think even that description is kind of generous. So as a result, like I said in the very beginning of this video, I went into this record pretty much blind, for lack of a better term, not really knowing what to expect or anticipate, only knowing that it would probably be very weird, very dark, and very complicated. And now in retrospect, I see that those very basic expectations were adequate, but not 100% accurate either. Because frankly, this album is so dense, bulky, and unorthodox that it's becoming quite transparently clear that maybe going in blind was a really bad idea. Now that's not to say that I didn't enjoy a good chunk of what was featured on this album, because I absolutely did. But even that very basic outcome took several dedicated listens, far more than I would normally set aside or allow for any album featured on the Metal Meltdown. Because quite frankly, it is only after several patient and intense listens that this album really begins to blossom and reveal itself for what it is. And even then, it's still entirely possible that you may not fully understand or appreciate the portrait in which Spectral Lore has just painted for us. And I'm not saying that to sound pretentious. I'm saying that because it's the truth, because I myself still don't quite fully understand what the fuck this album is really about after several dedicated listens. The lyrics are consistently very poetic, but very cryptic and abstract. At the same time, there's no clear goal, no clear message or narrative, at least not that I can pick up. The fact that I've gone in blind has proven to be an actual detriment as well, as this album apparently acts as a spiritual successor to another Spectral Lore record released nearly a decade ago. Statements like these found on the album's Bandcamp page don't really help either. If Spectral Lore themselves originally described Sentinel as epic and transcendental black metal music to inspire the warrior spirit and through it achieve spiritual transcendence, this album walks similar and emotional paths with greater maturity and awareness and can be seen as a comment on its predecessor's youthful enthusiasm, a kind of realignment that does not point towards a peaceful settlement, but on the strengthening of the need for rebellious Promethean praxis. In this respect, it is both a black metal and an anti-black metal album at the same time. Literally, what the fuck does any of that fucking mean? I am so confused. While obviously a much different band, I couldn't help but be reminded of some of the hyper-experimental and arguably pretentious material from a band like Liturgy, or more specifically how I felt in response to that material, because I was just really dumbfounded and confused by a lot of what was happening on this album. It honestly reminded me of being back in college and having hardcore fucked up an exam that I thought I thoroughly prepared for. I will say that while I still didn't quite fully understand the album intellectually or philosophically on future listens, I did at the very least appreciate the heart, the soul, and the emotion of the music itself, the jazz-like manner in which songs are composed and presented, and the truly unpredictable nature of this particular brand of progressive avant-garde atmospheric black metal. The opening track, for instance, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, initially starts off as a very stark and oppressive little black metal creation, emerging like some kind of creature from the bowels of hell, wearing classic black metal flavor on its sleeve. But after a few minutes, things begin to change a little bit. There are some disjointed and chaotic rhythmic changes. There are some not-so-subtle melodies emerging into the forefront of the sound. There are some progressive breaks that almost feel pulled from the realm of Tool or some really dark jazz fusion. Complemented very nicely, might I add, by some chanted vocals that, as far as I can tell, are sung in Alos's native Greek language, leading to perhaps one of the most cathartic climaxes on the entire album. There are so many subsections to this song, and it's all so satisfying that it could probably stand alone as an individual EP, and honest to God, it would fucking rule. Nobody would argue. You also have a track like The Sorcerer Above the Clouds, which builds on a very similar kind of structure and momentum, except this track feels a little bit more majestic, a little bit more ritualistic, dare I say supernatural. There are a lot of very dainty and mysterious strings and keyboards interwoven between the very furious black metal. And when combined later with some chanting vocals and some very artsy soundscapes, suddenly the track has a very psychedelic vibe to it. Something that is later effectively contrasted and emboldened by an absolutely apocalyptic climax. This is just fucking gigantic. Even some of the less adventurous and more atypical material on the album is still damn fucking impressive. Take, for instance, the album's title track and its downright infectious display of Greek melodic black metal. But unfortunately, even these moments aren't quite perfect. All of the songs I mentioned stretch from 9 to 12 minutes long, and honest to God, they don't fucking need to. Like, the meat of this album is already tough enough. It doesn't need to be this fatty as well. And it gets especially egregious and downright annoying on tracks like Apocalypse and Tarion, which combined take up nearly half an hour's worth of time and space on this album and accomplish very little in that time. Nearly half of Apocalypse, for instance, is just build-up for a mostly forgettable outburst of atmospheric black metal, whereas Tarion is quite literally 19 minutes of empty nothingness. There is nothing happening on this track whatsoever. If there is a legitimate reason as to why Spectral Lore, or any band for that reason, would want to end an album that, may I add, is already far too dense and bulky for its own good, on 19 minutes of literal fucking nothingness, then I simply haven't fucking figured it out. Plain and simple. And unfortunately, this particular album, as I mentioned before, isn't really doing a lot to actually help me figure it out. I really considered giving this a 2.5 out of 5, but I'm gonna settle for a 3. There is a lot of visible hard work and intelligence in this album, and as such, a lot of impressive music to be found. Unfortunately, it's been sandwiched in between just some incredibly confusing bullshit, some tracks that don't really go anywhere, some concepts that aren't really fully explained and just don't make a lot of sense, at least not to me. This is ultimately a case where I think maybe the album as a whole is just a little bit too big for its own good, and as such, I would really hesitate to recommend this to anyone who wasn't already heavily invested in Spectral Lore or already some kind of extreme prog or avant-garde music nerd. I will genuinely try to revisit this album in the future, but only after thoroughly investing some time in some of Spectral Lore's older records, namely the one that apparently ties into this one. So again, somewhat reluctantly, 3 out of 5, there are some fantastic and fascinating tidbits found throughout this album, but you're definitely gonna need to do your homework before you enter this exam. Plain and fucking simple. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.